In 1891, in the forgotten backrooms of an Appalachian courthouse, a single photograph became the key to a truth America was never meant to see. It wasn't discovered by a historian or a genealogist. It was found by a junior clerk, a boy barely out of his teens, tasked with a job no one else wanted, clearing the dust-choked shelves behind the 19th century tax records. And there, tucked between ledgers detailing land and livestock, was an object wrapped in yellowing blotter paper, bound with twine that crumbled at his touch. It felt wrong, out of place. Across the top margin of the photograph within, a crude, uneven stamp in faded purple ink gave a chilling command, not for public display. At first glance, it seemed ordinary enough for the era, a formal family portrait. A row of figures seated, another standing behind them, all posed stiffly before a painted backdrop of a serene pastoral scene. But the longer the clerk looked, the more a profound unease began to creep into the room, cold and silent. The individuals, they didn't seem like individuals at all. They blurred. The same sharp, unforgiving jawline repeated from one end of the group to the other, a geological feature carved into human flesh. The eyes, dark and deep-set, all slanted at an identical, unsettling angle. Even the hairlines receded in a mirrored pattern as if drawn by the same weary hand. It wasn't a family resemblance, it was an echo. A single face cast in different ages looking back from the same set of eyes. You have to understand, this wasn't just a feeling. It was a violation of the natural order, printed in silver nitrate and held in his trembling hands. A document of something that shouldn't be possible. The courthouse vault log, a heavy book bound in cracked leather, held the memory of every official document. Every birth, every death, every parcel of land. When the clerk, now deeply unnerved, checked for the photograph, he found nothing. It had no accession number. It didn't appear in any inventory of civic imagery. No weddings, no building dedications, no school graduations. It was a ghost in the archive. Whoever placed it behind those tax records had done so with deliberate stealth, outside the county's meticulous, almost religious process of record-keeping. They wanted it preserved, but they never wanted it found. Years later, the clerk, by then an old man, would recount how he'd privately shown the image to a retired records officer, a man who had spent 50 years breathing the dust of that vault. The old officer took one look, his face paling, and refused to handle it for long. He wouldn't speak their name, but he pointed a trembling finger toward the east, toward the mountains that clawed at the sky beyond the main river. He remembered a settlement out there, a place known for keeping to itself, a place wrapped in a silence as thick as the morning fog. And then he whispered the words that would haunt the clerk for the rest of his life. There was no one in that house you could point to and say they didn't belong to the same mother. Honestly, what would you do? Confronted with a truth so stark, so unsettling that even the keepers of history refused to acknowledge it, the clerk was given a simple, unwritten order: rewrap the photograph, return it to the darkness, and forget what he saw. But some things, once seen, can never be unseen. A whispered historical rumor from that time, passed down from the old lawman of the county, says that the traveling portraitist who owned that painted backdrop, the one who worked the Appalachian counties between 1888 and 1892, he left the region abruptly. He sold his wagon and his camera for a fraction of their worth and was never heard from again. He told one man in a saloon, his hands shaking so badly he couldn't hold his glass, that he had taken a picture of a family that wasn't a family at all, but one soul trapped in a dozen bodies. The photograph was not defaced, not burned, simply hidden. Placed where it would not be seen by the public, preserved in a vault meant to protect the county's memory, yet surgically excised from it. The question that hangs in the silence of that backroom is almost too heavy to bear. Was the concealment meant to spare the family from the world's judgment, or to spare the world from the family? The census books offer the first clue. The volume for 1880 is thick, its stitched binding groaning under the weight of 1,000 lives. Each page is a grid of names, occupations, ages, places of birth, all entered in the same clerk's looping, elegant hand. For the township east of the main river, the columns are filled neatly enough. Farmers, laborers, wives keeping house. But in the far left box under the heading Surname, a single word repeats, and repeats, and repeats. For 38 consecutive households down page after page, the same name appears without a single deviation. The first impression is a clerical error, a lazy shortcut. But then you turn the page to the next township and variety blooms. Smith, Taylor, Carter, Miller. The world returns to normal. Only there, in that isolated stretch of land, does the pattern collapse into a terrifying monolith. By 1890, the census was taken again. The settlement's population had barely changed, births and deaths balancing on a razor's edge. The surname, it remained the same for every single resident, every man, woman, and child. The columns for place of birth of mother and place of birth of father offered no escape, no hint of an outside world. All were marked simply, "This county." But it's the marginalia, the faint pencil notes surveyors made for their own use, that truly chills the blood. Next to one household of 9, a barely legible remark reads, "Son, age 14, identical in feature to father. Remarkable likeness." The same observation appears 3 more times before ceasing altogether, as if the surveyor, a man of logic and numbers, decided that to continue nodding the impossible was a form of madness. A surviving field diary from that 1880 enumerator, a man named Silas Croft, sheds more light on the oppressive atmosphere. He describes the journey to the settlement as deeply unwelcoming. 2 silent men met him on the road, their eyes cold and watchful, and insisted on escorting him to each household. He wrote, "I was not invited indoors, not once." All interviews were conducted at doorways or from porches, the dark interiors of the homes looming behind the figures who answered his questions. No one offered him a meal. No one offered him a cup of coffee. A profound breach of the hospitality that defined these mountains. You have to understand, a government man was an event. To be denied entry, to be treated not as a guest but as a contaminant, it was a message, a clear and silent warning. The enumerator, Silas Croft, makes no explicit accusation in his diary. He was a man of the government. His job was to record facts, not feelings. But you can feel the shift in the very rhythm of his entries. The early pages are filled with the small, grounding details of a man traveling through the countryside, the sound of hogs in a pen, the particular way the light hit a ridge at dawn. But after the 3rd day in the settlement, the descriptions shrink. The entries become brittle, recording only the bare essentials, names and numbers. It's as if he was trying to get out, to finish his work with the least possible interaction, the least possible observation. As if looking too closely was a danger he could feel in his bones. By the time the county clerk received the completed census, nothing in the official summary hinted at the deep strangeness of what Silas had recorded. The consolidation of surnames was noted, yes, but as a statistical curiosity, not as a social anomaly requiring investigation. At the state level, the data passed without a whisper of comment. Statistical anomalies were not yet a cause for alarm unless they were tied to taxation or land disputes. Still, the visual impact of those census pages is something you can't shake. That single surname, written over and over in identical cursive, produces a rhythm like the tolling of a single, unyielding bell, one that never, ever changes pitch. It's the paper and ink proof of a closed loop. If you've come this far, you're beginning to understand. Comment, the truth bleeds through below. You're not just watching this, you're becoming part of the investigation. Let's talk about the children, because in any society, the children are the future. They are the sign of health, of continuation. But what if the continuation itself is the sickness? The closure of the East Ridge schoolhouse is noted in the 1887 county education ledger with a single sterile phrase: instruction discontinued, attendance irregular. There was no fire, no flood, no lack of funds, all common reasons for shutting down a rural school. The entry is buried between 2 routine notations, a whisper of an event that was meant to be forgotten. The schoolhouse itself was a simple, one-room frame building. Its windows faced the dirt road on one side, and on the other the edge of the family's land, a border between the known world and theirs. The teacher assigned that term was a young woman named Abigail White. 23 years old, fresh from the state normal school, filled with the kind of hope and ambition that the mountains so often extinguish. Her surviving letters to the superintendent, preserved in the courthouse vault, tell a story of dawning horror. The first, written after just 2 weeks, is cheerful. She thanks the board for her appointment, notes the children's fine attendance and obedience. But the second letter, dated in late October, is markedly different. The tone has shifted from bright to wary. She writes, and you can feel the careful way she chooses her words. The pupils speak alike. Not merely in accent, but in the very measure of their words, as if they have rehearsed them before arriving each morning. Can you imagine that? A room full of children, a dozen voices, but only one cadence. Miss White's letters grow more disturbed. She describes how the children gave identical phrasing in their answers to her questions, no matter the subject. And more unnervingly, the pauses before their replies would fall as one shadow across the room. It wasn't just their speech. She records that despite the school serving children from at least 8 different households, their physical appearance was hauntingly similar. Pale complexions, dark hair, and an identical set to the mouth when concentrating. She doesn't accuse, she doesn't use the words the rest of us are thinking. She was a proper young woman in a difficult position. Instead, she writes with a chillingly detached observation. I cannot tell them apart at a distance, save by height. By early November, her attendance book, a small, leather-bound volume, shows a steep decline. Entire groups of siblings began missing the same days, with no explanation offered. When she did what a good teacher was supposed to do, when she visited their homes to maintain rapport with the parents, she was always met at the porch. She was told the children were otherwise occupied. She never, not once, crossed a threshold. She was kept outside, just like the census taker. The family's homes were a fortress, and the secrets they held were not for her to see. Her final letter, dated December 3rd, is brief, unsigned, as if written in a desperate hurry, her hand shaking. In it, she states she will be leaving her post before the term ends, advising that continued instruction under present conditions is unwise. The county never appointed a replacement. The school was locked, its windows boarded up from the inside and left to rot. Here's a disturbing real-world quote from a 19th-century physician studying isolated communities, Dr. Samuel Cartwright. He wrote, "When a people turn inward away from the natural stream of human congress, the very spirit of the blood grows stagnant. It ceases to seek the new and begins to worship its own reflection." A former student from that final, aborted term at the East Ridge schoolhouse was interviewed by a local historian decades later, when he was a very old man. He described how lessons would sometimes stop dead when an elder from the family appeared silently at the open doorway. He said the children would rise in perfect unison, speak a short, rhythmic phrase he could no longer recall, and then sit again in absolute silence until the visitor departed. He described it not as a sign of respect, but as a form of attunement, as if the elder didn't need to speak to give a command. The children simply knew. No record explains what Miss Abigail White found so unworkable, so unwise in her post. But her 3 letters remain in the vault, their ink faded, their tone shifting from hope to caution to pure, unadulterated fear. A dozen voices, but only one manner of speaking, and an echo in a room that was meant to be filled with the sounds of individual children, learning about a world they would never be allowed to join. The schoolhouse no longer stands, its foundation stones scattered in the tall grass like broken teeth. But the silence it left behind, that remains. If the school records are unsettling, the medical register is where the story turns from social anomaly to biological horror. The county's register for 1885 contains a single, unsigned entry under visiting practitioners. Dr. R.C. Harrow, itinerant physician, circuit covering 5 townships. His personal records, a bound ledger with a warped leather cover, somehow survived. And within its brittle pages, a week of visits stands apart from all the others. Over the course of 7 days, Dr. Harrow recorded examinations for 17 individuals in the East Ridge settlement. His notes are unusually, almost obsessively, detailed. He lists not just symptoms but anatomical observations, mirrored curvature of clavicles, bicuspids aligned in uniform arch, and torso proportion near identical in three brothers, differing only in weight. Nowhere else in his decades of practice does he remark on such things. But here, every note is a study in repetition. The first examination is described clinically. A boy of 11 complaining of joint stiffness. Harrow observes bilateral symmetry unusual for age, and then leaves the line blank where a question about hereditary conditions might normally follow. By the third patient, a woman of 28, he abandons the family history section entirely, drawing a sharp, angry diagonal line through it. In a later margin, in handwriting so small it's clear he didn't want it to be easily read, a single phrase appears. Ancestry refused. They wouldn't talk about it. They wouldn't admit what he could plainly see with his own two eyes. Like the census taker and the schoolteacher, Dr. Harrow was kept at a distance. A surviving invoice for his services lists porch consultations, suggesting he was never invited inside a single home. The absence of his usual environmental notes, comments on temperature, lighting, or hearth smoke, all present in his other rural accounts, supports this. He was treating the symptoms of a closed system from the outside, standing on the porch looking in. On the fifth day, his notes change. They become cryptic, abbreviated. Diagnoses are reduced to single letters. Treatment recommendations become symbols: a cross for pus, a circle for dietary change, a triangle for simple observation. He was no longer diagnosing individuals, he was cataloging a phenomenon. At the bottom of one page is a faint, incomplete sentence, a thought interrupted. Not advisable to. The rest is lost under a smear of ink. Was it an accident? Or did he deliberately obscure a conclusion that was too dangerous to write down? When his ledger was reviewed decades later by the county medical board, it was filed away with a dismissive note. General practice incomplete. No follow-up was ever recorded. No referral to a larger facility. The final page of his week in the settlement is the most chilling of all. Instead of a patient's name, there is a single entry. It just says patriarch. Followed by appearance without deviation from prior cases, speech reserved, declines examination. No fee is recorded, no treatment is prescribed, the ledger closes there. The next page begins in another township a world away, a farmhand injured in a fall, as if nothing had happened, as if the week he spent on that ridge was a fever dream, but it wasn't, it was real. In the parish register for St. Mark's Chapel, the marriage entries from 1862 to 1894 form an unbroken column of neat ink lines. Names, parents, witnesses. The sacred bonds of matrimony, recorded for God and the county to see. At first, nothing seems unusual. In small, isolated communities, it wasn't unheard of for cousins to marry. The options were limited. But as you read the register in sequence, a pattern emerges that is too precise, too perfect to be coincidence. The surname is the same in nearly every line for both the bride and the groom. That we already know. But then you look at the parents' names. In some cases, they are identical across separate weddings held years apart. In one 1877 entry, the bride's parents are listed with the exact same full names as the groom's parents. Not similar, not brothers, identical. Think about what that means. The tree isn't just branching, it's folding back on itself, the leaves touching the roots, creating a perfect, terrible circle. What's even stranger is how the officiating priests handled it. One priest, a Father Melrose, always completed the parental names in full, his script never wavering, no matter how many times he wrote the same names over and over. He recorded the truth, no matter how unsettling. But another, a Father Danton, often left those lines blank, drawing a short, horizontal stroke instead, an M dash of omission, an admission of silence. The pattern wasn't invisible to them. It was noticed, it was recorded, and it was allowed to continue. In the parish vestry chest, a dusty folder contains the banns, the formal announcements of upcoming marriages, meant to be read aloud to the congregation on 3 successive Sundays. This was the community's chance to object, to voice any reason why the couple should not be joined in holy matrimony. For the marriages from the East Ridge settlement, the banns were sometimes posted on the chapel door. but according to the priest's own notes, they were never, not once, read aloud from the pulpit. The flock was not given the chance to object. The warning was never sounded. By the late 1880s, the state required civil marriage certificates to accompany the church entries. These forms, stored in the county archive, reproduce the same looping, recursive nightmare. Identical names for both sets of parents, sometimes repeated from certificates issued a decade earlier. The handwriting is careful, deliberate, never rushed, never crossed out. The clerk who processed them, a man named Ezra Thorne, left no commentary in the margins. He did his job, but in his annual reports to the county, the marriage statistics for that township are consistently, inexplicably lower than the population would suggest. Whether by omission or discretion, he was hiding the anomaly. He was helping to keep the secret. Reviewing these documents in sequence is a disorienting, almost sickening experience. A father's name in one year returns as a groom's name the next, then appears again as the father in another union with his own daughter. The family tree collapses until it is no longer a tree at all. It is a wreath laid on the grave of a bloodline. Let's turn from the sacred to the profane, from the church register to the tax roll. The 1885 county tax assessment includes a marginal note beside one property on the eastern ridge. Assessment made at entry, not invited in, porch only. Such a remark was rare. Assessors were figures of authority. They went inside. They sat at kitchen tables. They measured rooms. To be kept on the porch was an insult, but it was more than that. It was a statement of sovereignty. The assessor's private field notebook, a far more honest document, gives the reason. He adds a phrase he didn't dare put on the official roll: for reasons of decency. The property was a two-story clapboard house, shutters drawn tight despite the summer heat. The door was opened not by the owner but by a younger man whose features so closely matched the older man who soon joined him that the assessor first assumed they were brothers. They were not. They were father and son. And they were, in his words, exact in likeness. Both had the same narrow jaw, the same deep-set eyes, the same uneven part in their dark hair. The older man stepped out, closing the door firmly behind him, positioning himself between the assessor and the entryway, a human shield. The younger man remained just inside the doorway, motionless, his face a blank mask. The assessor tried to make small talk, the weather, livestock, but the older man's replies were clipped, factual, devoid of any warmth. He was a machine reporting data. At one point, the assessor glanced past the older man into the dim interior of the house. The younger man was still there, standing just over the threshold, his expression unreadable, and the assessor's notes capture a detail that is pure psychological horror. He writes that the younger man's eyes were fixed, not on him, the outsider, but on the older man's back, as if awaiting a silent instruction, as if he were not a person but an extension of the other man's will. When a question was directed at the younger man, he did not answer. The older man spoke for him without turning around, giving the precise count of sheep. This happened twice more before the assessor gave up trying to address them as two separate people. The meeting was over in less than 10 minutes. The valuation was recorded, the improvements column marked with a definitive none. In his private notebook, the assessor underlined the phrase "kept on porch" 3 times. And below it, he added the 7 words that defined the entire encounter: 2 men, exact likeness, only one voice. The tax roll was accepted without question. The valuation remained unchanged for 5 years. Whatever lay beyond that door, whatever was being hidden for reasons of decency, was protected. The county wanted its money, but it did not want the truth. The record shows only what could be observed from a few feet away, on a wooden porch, under the watchful eyes of 2 men who were one. A disturbing thought experiment. Imagine a system so perfect in its isolation that it develops its own rituals, its own mathematics, its own sacred numbers. In the County Historical Society, among a stack of ledgers from long-dead merchants, the account book from Pritchard's General Store stands out. The pages for the years 1881 to 1893 list every purchase in the neat, meticulous script of a man who believed in order. But one customer account is unlike any other. The surname matches the one that fills the census rolls east of the river, and every single entry under that name records purchases in exact multiples of 7. 7 loaves of bread, 7 pounds of sugar, 7 bars of soap, 7 bolts of unbleached muslin. Even nails and lamp oil were measured out in quantities divisible by the same unyielding number. The pattern is unbroken for 12 years. 12 years. No entry deviates. No seasonal shift, no harvest bounty or winter scarcity alters the figure. The only variation is in the items themselves. Salt is replaced with flour in the spring, molasses with coffee in the winter, but always, always in sevens. Mr. Pritchard himself seems to have accepted it without question. In a letter to his supplier, he refers to them simply as the Ridge account, and notes that they settle on the 7th of the month without fail. His choice of words is as precise as their accounting. Settle, not pay. The 7th, not the first or the last. It was a ritual. A surviving receipt dated October 7, 1888 is especially telling. The customer's signature is a barely legible scrawl, the same looping initial repeated twice, as if the writer began to form a name and then thought better of it. Beneath it, the total is neatly boxed, $7.07. Coincidence? Or a design so perfect it was invisible to the man who wrote it down? An elderly shopkeeper from a neighboring town, interviewed in 1911, added a human detail to this strange arithmetic. He recalled once trying to sell a single, extra sack of flour to one of the Ridge men, after the usual 7 sacks had been loaded. The offer was declined without a word of explanation. The man left empty-handed rather than break the pattern. He would rather his family go without than accept a quantity that was not 7. The account at Pritchard's store ends abruptly in August 1893. The final entry, 7 pounds of coffee, 7 bars of soap, 7 pounds of lard, is marked paid. And then nothing. No more purchases follow. The next year's ledger is pristine, the surname absent entirely. The archivist who later catalogued the book underlined the 7s on a few sample pages, a silent finger pointing to the mystery. But no one followed the clue. The ledger now rests in a flat archive drawer, the column of 7s marching down page after page. Was it habit? Superstition? Or was it the coded measure of a world with its own physics, its own unbreakable laws, a world where 7 was the number of completion, the number of life, the number that kept the outside world at bay? The county death register for 1891 records the passing of a woman from the East Ridge settlement. The cause is listed with a single, ambiguous word: decline. The location: family residence. The line for the attending physician's signature is empty, a blank space where the validation of the outside world should be. 3 days later, the township sexton's log notes the opening of a grave at the settlement's small, private family plot, but the time of the work is deeply unusual. Commenced at 4:15 a.m., a second line in a lighter, hastier hand adds, completed before sunrise. No clergy name appears. No church service is referenced. The only surviving account of what happened in that pre-dawn darkness comes from a neighbor, a woman named Althea Corman, whose testimony was recorded years later. She recalled waking to the sound of shovels striking earth, a rhythmic, purposeful sound in the deep stillness of the morning. From the edge of her property, she could see them. Figures moving in the half-light, their shapes just discernible against the paling sky. There were no candles, no lanterns, just the silent, efficient work of men digging a grave. According to Mrs. Corman, the burial was conducted in absolute, unnerving silence. The men worked with a practiced coordination, lowering the simple pine casket, filling the grave with quick, even shovelfuls. No prayers were spoken. No hymns were sung. Once the last of the soil was packed down, the group stood still for a few moments, their heads bowed, and then dispersed without a single word to one another. When the historian asked Mrs. Corman why she hadn't approached, why she hadn't offered condolences as any good neighbor would, her answer was simple and immediate. It was not for outsiders. She had lived near them her entire life. She had learned the boundaries. She knew their ways were not the world's ways. The county coroner's files for that year show no autopsy report. In fact, there is no coroner's record at all. A procedural gap that should have triggered an immediate inquiry, especially for a death unattended by a physician. But no inquiry ever occurred. The silence of the family was matched by the silence of the county. This wasn't a one-time event. Other burials from the same settlement show similar patterns. Graves opened before dawn, no clergy present, no public notices. The church registers list the deaths, but they omit the funeral dates, leaving only a name and the single, stark word, buried. This absence of ritual is a profound statement. In the mountains, funerals were the most important social events. They were public affirmations of a shared life and a shared grief, with food, music, and prayer. But on the ridge, there was only the sound of earth striking wood and the quiet dispersal of those who belonged. The family plot remains today, its stones weathered and uneven. Some bear only initials. Others are completely unmarked. And the question that rises from that cold ground is deafening. Was the silence an act of private grief, a rejection of custom, or was it the final, logical extension of a life lived behind walls that permitted no outsider's voice, even the voice of God? The county's birth register for April 1894 records the arrival of a male child in the East Ridge settlement. The midwife's name, Clara Loach, appears in careful ink, her signature a practiced flourish. It is the last time her name appears in any official record on earth. Mrs. Loach was a pillar of the community, a woman who had served the rural districts for over 20 years. She was known to keep her own informal ledger of deliveries, a testament to the new lives she'd brought into the world. On the day of the birth, witnesses saw her cart pass along the ridge road in the early morning. She was prepared, carrying her standard kit. According to the official birth record, the child was delivered without complication. The father's name, of course, matches the dominant surname of the settlement. Nothing seems amiss. But 3 days later, a neighbor, worried that she hadn't seen smoke from Clara's chimney, went to check on her. The front door was locked from the inside. The shutters were closed. Peering through a gap in the curtain, the neighbor could see Mrs. Loach's satchel resting on the table, neatly packed as if ready for the next call. On the bed, the coverlet was smooth, the pillow undented. It had not been slept in. The county constable forced entry. The cottage was cold and still. Nothing was disturbed. Her clothes hung in the wardrobe. Her boots were by the door. A jar of fresh milk, delivered the morning before, sat unopened on the counter. There was no sign of a struggle. There was no note. The fire in the hearth had gone cold, suggesting it hadn't been tended since the night she returned from the ridge. Here's the detail that turns a simple disappearance into something far more sinister. The constable's written report includes a line that seems almost reluctant, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was writing. No tracks found beyond her own leading to or from the property. The ground was firm and dry. A wagon, a horse, a group of men, they would have left some trace. But there was nothing. Only Clara Loach's own footprints leading up to her door, and then an absence. Neighbors told the constable that Clara had seemed distracted, unusually quiet after her last trip. One woman recalled her pausing mid-conversation, her head cocked as if listening for a sound no one else could hear, before excusing herself abruptly. The investigation, if you can even call it that, ended almost as soon as it began. With no evidence of foul play and no immediate family to press the matter, the case was closed. The official heading: voluntary departure. Her possessions were inventoried, packed into crates, and stored in the back room of the courthouse, where they remain to this day, artifacts of a life that simply stopped. There is nothing in the record to explain what happened in the hours between her successful delivery of a child on East Ridge and the discovery of her empty, silent home. A child was born. A midwife attended. And then the midwife, the one person from the outside world who had been allowed in to witness their most intimate moment, vanished from the face of the earth. In the county ledger beside her name, the space for current residence is left blank, as if even the paper understood she no longer belonged to this world. A whispered rumor from the era claims that the child Mrs. Loach delivered was born with a caul, a thin membrane covering the face, which folklore said was a sign of a second sight. The family, it was said, believed the child could see the sickness in their blood, and that the midwife, having seen it too, had to be silenced before she could speak of it. Now, consider the barn. Its end was recorded in the 1891 County Maintenance Ledger under uninsured structure loss. The entry is terse clinical. Privately owned barn East Ridge collapsed. No injuries, weather fair. No further details. No inspection ordered, case closed, but this was no ordinary barn. It was a landmark known to everyone in the surrounding townships. A large, square-built structure set back from the road, its siding weathered to a uniform gray. And it had one defining, peculiar feature. No livestock was ever seen entering or leaving it. It wasn't for animals. It wasn't for hay. It was for them. The only surviving testimony from someone who had been inside comes from a hired hand sent to deliver lumber that summer. He said the interior was completely bare, except for two neat rows of benches, and these benches were not arranged for a sermon or a meeting. They were arranged in a perfect circle, leaving a wide, open space in the center of the packed earth floor. He remembered noticing that the light from the high, narrow windows fell directly into that circle, as if the barn had been built as a kind of solar clock or a stage. The collapse happened in late August. County weather records confirm it. No rain, no storms, the air was still. Neighbors heard a deep wooden crack like a giant bone snapping, followed by a rumbling crash. By the time anyone arrived, the roof had caved in and the walls had splayed outward, as though the structure had been pushed apart from within. It was in the aftermath, as the family salvaged the lumber, that the benches were found. And on them, a discovery that confirmed this was a place of ritual. In the center of each seat, a set of initials had been carved, the same two letters over and over without a single variation. The cuts were deep, deliberate, made by a steady hand. Not a single bench was unmarked. The lumber salvager, a man who recorded the detail in his own account book, wrote that he asked one of the older men from the family about the carvings. The reply was flat, devoid of emotion. "They're all ours." No other explanation was offered. The collapsed remains were cleared away with an almost frantic efficiency. Within days, the ground was leveled, the space left vacant. No new structure was ever built there. By the next spring, tall grass had erased the outline of where the barn once stood. In the courthouse, the only trace of its existence is that single, sterile line in a ledger. But the question of what it was for, and why it collapsed on a calm summer day, remains. A circle of benches, each one marked for a member of a family with only one name, a church where they worshiped themselves. There are stories of those who tried to breach the wall of the settlement, not with authority but with simple human connection, and those stories always end in failure. The name of Mr. Jonathan Eves survives not in any official county archive, but in the 1892 membership log of the local Merchants Association. He was a traveling merchant, a reliable man who brought the outside world, bolts of cloth, imported tea, pocket mirrors, to the isolated corners of the county. It was during his regular stops near the East Ridge settlement that he first saw her, a young woman who would come to the roadside whenever his wagon passed, her eyes filled with a quiet, desperate curiosity. According to a statement he gave years later to a friend, Eves began leaving aside small gifts for her, a ribbon, a glass bead, a packet of tea. She always accepted them politely, but she never ever stepped beyond the invisible line where the public road met the slope of her family's land. By midsummer, Eves, perhaps foolishly, perhaps bravely, decided to seek a formal introduction. He walked the narrow path up to the family's main house. He was met on the porch before he could even reach the door by an older man, one of the patriarchs. The man listened to his request in total silence, his face a granite mask. When Eves finished, the reply was slow, deliberate, and utterly devastating. He said, "She has never met anyone she wasn't related to." Think about that sentence. It wasn't delivered as a threat, Eves later recalled, but as a simple, unchangeable law of their universe. A statement of fact as immutable as the sunrise. When the merchant, undeterred, asked if he might at least speak with her directly, the man shook his head once, a slow, final negation, and added, "We keep our own." Jonathan Eves was a smart man. He understood. He did not press the matter. He returned to his wagon, turned it around, and made no further deliveries to the settlement that year. His merchandise ledger shows the omission clearly. Every route is marked, every sale recorded except for the East Ridge stop. He returned only once in the early spring of the following year. He stopped his wagon at the edge of their land. He waited, and when no one appeared, he moved on without unloading a single item. Her name is not recorded anywhere. She exists only in this second-hand story, a ghost of a possibility, a life that was never allowed to happen. What remains is that one sentence carried through the years. She has never met anyone she wasn't related to. It is the most concise and complete description of the settlement that exists. It is their constitution, their creed, and their curse. And for that young woman standing somewhere just out of sight, it was a life sentence. The final breakdown of the family didn't come from the outside world. It came from within. The lawsuit appears in the 1897 county court docket under a modest heading, Property Dispute, Parcel 14. The filing pits two plaintiffs against two defendants. All four share the same surname. The land in question was 42 acres of wooded slope and pasture, valuable only because it was surrounded by the family's other holdings. A dispute of this sort should have been settled at a kitchen table, but this one, for some reason, escalated. It reached the formal court, requiring each side to produce proof of rightful ownership, and that proof took the form of family trees. The genealogies arrived in court on identical sheets of lined paper. They stretched back 6 generations, ending at the same founding couple who had settled the ridge before the county even existed. Every branch, every marriage, every child's name matched precisely between the two documents. The birth years were identical. The death dates were the same. The court transcripts show the presiding judge, a man clearly bewildered by what was in front of him, questioning both sides about the duplication. Each replied with unnerving sincerity that their genealogy was accurate, recorded from memory and family record. Neither would acknowledge the simple, terrifying truth. They were claiming the exact same ancestry without a single point of divergence. There were no separate branches. There was only the trunk. The county surveyor, called to testify about boundary lines, noted that the homes of the opposing parties were within sight of each other. He stated, for the record, there is no clear demarcation between the properties as used. There were no fences. The livestock grazed freely across both parcels. The distinction, the conflict, existed only in their minds. The judge, bound to rule on the evidence presented, found himself in an impossible position. The genealogies, the very documents meant to establish a separate claim, offered no separation at all. There was no marriage to an outside family, no new bloodline that could establish a unique right to the land. In the end, his ruling was a legalistic shrug. He declared both parties co-owners, effectively restoring the informal arrangement that had always existed. The court clerk's notes from that day include a single marginal remark: argument between cousins. He underlined the word cousins twice, but they were something far closer and far more complex than that. The genealogies still lie in the courthouse vault, filed side by side. They are perfect mirror images. It's impossible to say which belongs to which party or if they were ever truly separate at all. In a place where the branches of the tree always return to the same root, can there ever be such a thing as another side? Or is it all just one, endless self, arguing with its own reflection? Now let's return to the photographs. Not the one found by the clerk, but another set taken 2 years later in 1893. The index book for the County Relief Committee notes their existence. Photographs, East Ridge, filed with public aid records. But no images are attached to the file today. The negatives, the committee's final report claims, were misplaced in transit to state offices. A convenient loss. These photographs were taken by a man named Elma Vance, a charity photographer hired to document the conditions of rural families for a winter relief campaign. His other work survives, haunting images of weathered farmhouses and barefoot children. For East Ridge, only one item remains, a single proof sheet discovered decades later in a mislabeled envelope. It shows 10 individuals, arranged conventionally, but the effect is anything but conventional. Each face, the features are a near-perfect replication. The same sharp jaw, the same deep-set eyes, the same pursed line of the mouth. Vance's own handwritten notes, preserved with the sheet, mention uniformity of feature twice, an observation he makes nowhere else. The negatives were supposed to be sent to the state charity board for a public exhibit on rural hardship. But in a letter from the board, they acknowledge receipt of the shipment, but note 2 plates are missing, the East Ridge series. No explanation. No follow-up. The proof sheet itself bears a faint diagonal crease, and the envelope it was found in was marked in red pencil, "Exempt, do not exhibit." Whose hand wrote that? Why was this family, among all the impoverished families in the county, deemed exempt from public view? A former committee member interviewed in her old age recalled the images. She said, "Those photographs weren't right for what we were trying to show." When pressed to explain, she paused for a long time and then added the 5 words that explain everything. It wasn't the poverty. It was something else. Something they didn't want the public to see. Something they couldn't explain and didn't dare try. The proof sheet now rests in a clear archival sleeve, the 10 faces staring out from a century of darkness. If you stare at them long enough, the slight differences in age and gender begin to dissolve, and the similarities become overwhelming, hypnotic. The faces blur into one another until you are looking at a single, repeating pattern, a human fractal. The reason for their removal from the public record remains undocumented. But the effect was absolute. Their likenesses were hidden. The world was protected from a truth it wasn't ready for, and so the only surviving visual evidence of their existence is this: 10 nearly identical faces, frozen in time, waiting in the dark for a viewer who will finally ask the right question. Not who are these people, but what are they? The end came in 1902. The order is preserved in the county board minutes, a single cold paragraph under public health ordinances. It states that the property at East Ridge was to be vacated and secured within 10 days, citing conditions unfit for continued habitation. There are no supporting documents, no photographs, no inspection notes, no witness statements, just the directive. The motion passed unanimously. By then, the property was the last occupied parcel in a cluster of abandoned holdings. County records list no births there since 1894, no marriages since 1892. The census of 1900, however, still recorded 9 residents, all bearing the same surname. The gears of bureaucracy turned. A copy of the eviction notice was to be delivered in person by the county constable. The return slip, meant to be signed by a recipient to confirm delivery, bears only the constable's initials and the date. There is no signature from the family. From that point on, the official record falls completely silent. No inventory of possessions was taken. No account of livestock removal. The assessor's roll for the following year simply lists the property as vacant. No structures fit for use. A local newspaper, years later, wrote, "The old family was gone by the spring of '02. No mention of where they went. No mention of anyone seeing them leave. A state archivist, reviewing the file in the 1960s, noted in the margin, 'No witness to departure found.' The archivist had searched. She had looked for recollections from nearby residents who were still living. Most claimed they hadn't seen the family in months, even before the order was issued. One farmer recalled passing the property on his way to market and finding it shuttered tight, the door barred from the inside, a profound and final silence hanging over the land. The property remained untouched, unused for decades. In aerial surveys from the 1930s, the house is just a dark shape under the trees, its roof partially collapsed. By the 1950s, even that outline had been swallowed by the forest. Today, the only official proof that anyone ever left is the eviction order itself, a single paragraph in a bound volume, sandwiched between an approval for a bridge repair and the purchase of new voting booths. It's an act of administrative violence carried out on paper. But with no one to say they saw the family go, a chilling possibility remains. Did the county arrive to escort them out? Or did they arrive to find the house already empty, the 9 residents having simply vanished? slipped away into the mountains or into something else entirely, leaving behind nothing but a locked door and a silence that the county was only too eager to make permanent. The 1910 federal census for the county is a map of a changed world, but in the place where the East Ridge settlement should have been, there is only a blank space. A few scattered properties with new, unrelated names. The column where the surname once repeated like a drumbeat is now replaced by a quiet, orderly variety. The erasure is absolute. In the birth ledger, no child is recorded with that name after the turn of the century. In the marriage index, the name vanishes completely. The family's existence, as far as the public record is concerned, simply ceases, but in the courthouse vault they remain. In the older documents, sealed away from the light, the census rolls, the property deeds, the marriage certificates, all intact, but they are disconnected from any public-facing index. The story has been deliberately broken into fragments, scattered so that no casual researcher could ever piece it back together. Local accounts from the early 20th century show how the family passed from a known, if feared, entity into a dark folktale. Children in nearby villages played a game called The Ones Who Married Only Themselves. By the time those children were adults, the settlement was just a cautionary rumor, a place that had been cleaned out by the county, a necessary, unspoken act of social hygiene. But there was never an official narrative, never an explanation. There was only the disappearance and the relief that followed. S.A. county clerk, reviewing old land disputes in the 1930s, made a note in a private memo that was never meant to be seen. He wrote, "All references to the family name, family, have been removed from active registers by direction of a former board. No such order appears in any meeting minutes. No law at the time would have mandated it. It was an act of quiet, deliberate, extralegal erasure." The most compelling piece of evidence is a single, handwritten index card from the old filing system, found tucked into the back of a cabinet in the vault. It bears the family name in fading ink, and below it, a single damning notation: "See restricted." The card was not filed alphabetically. It was loose, dropped between unrelated entries, a secret signpost left by someone who knew the truth was being buried. Whether this erasure was an act of bureaucratic tidying, social protection, or something closer to a cover-up is impossible to prove now. But the outcome is the same. In the public eye, the family story ends with a slammed door. Their name was excised from the living record of the county, their history reclassified from fact to rumor. The documents in the vault remain, locked away. And inside, that surname waits in long, unbroken columns of ink, as if the people themselves were still there on paper, refusing to let go. Some names vanish from history by chance. A fire, a flood, the simple decay of time. But others are erased with purpose. The East Ridge family left no farewell note, no final photograph for the public record, no grave marked in stone that anyone outside their circle could read. They became a ghost story, a whisper used to frighten children. Yet in the sealed, climate-controlled quiet of the courthouse vault, their presence is a tangible thing. Page after page, ledger after ledger, the same name is written until the ink itself seems weary of the repetition. This wasn't just a family. It was a closed system, a nation of one bloodline with its own laws, its own rituals, its own biology. They created a world that was a perfect reflection of themselves, and in doing so, they sealed their own fate. When a community decides that the world outside no longer applies to them, that its rules and its very blood are a contamination, the world eventually responds. It isolates, it condemns, and finally it forgets. The county didn't just evict a family, it erased a reality that it could not comprehend or control. A reality that was a mirror showing a distorted, terrifying version of what community and kinship could become when taken to its absolute, logical extreme. The final entry in the last known document to mention them is not a name, but a number. In the 1902 eviction order, the property is referred to simply as Parcel 14. They were reduced from a people to a plot of land, stripped of their identity, their history, their faces, and turned into a problem of geography. Whether they left by choice, were forced out under cover of darkness, or simply dissolved back into the mountains that had hidden them for so long, the result is the same. A bloodline carefully curated and fiercely protected for 7 generations, folded in on itself until it was no longer visible to the world outside. They were erased from the present, but they are not gone from the record. Not entirely, because the records are still here. The photograph is still here, waiting in the dark, a testament to a story that America tried to bury. This story isn't really about the past. It's a chilling lesson about the lines we draw between us and them, and the terrifying places that those lines can lead. When a group defines itself by what it excludes, the walls they build to keep others out eventually become a prison. The family on East Ridge achieved a kind of perfect purity, a perfect isolation. But that purity was a death sentence. They created a world with no windows and no doors, and in the end, the world outside simply sealed the tomb. It makes you wonder how many other stories like this are out there, buried in the backrooms of courthouses, hidden in mislabeled envelopes, waiting for a single, curious hand to pull them back into the light. The truth doesn't die. It just waits. What do you think was the real reason the county erased them? Was it an act of mercy, to protect the last members of a dying bloodline from a world that would have torn them apart? Or was it an act of fear to hide a biological and social truth so profoundly disturbing that they had to pretend it never existed at all? Let me know your theory in the comments below. There are more vaults to open, more stories buried in the dark, whispering to be told. If you believe these truths need to be brought into the light, subscribe to this channel and ring the notification bell. You'll be there when we find the next key. And before you go, tell us where you're watching from. Your country, your city, your local time. So we know who else is awake with us, listening to the shadows.